Tonight we delve into the eerie world of M.R. James with his collection A Thin Ghost and Others, renowned for his masterful ghost stories. James invites us into a realm where the supernatural intertwines with the ordinary. As we journey through these chilling tales, prepare to be haunted by shadows from the past and spectral encounters that defy explanation. Let the unsettling narratives and atmospheric settings draw you into a world where the unseen lurks just beyond the edge of perception. Chapter 1. The Residence at Whitminster. Dr. Ashton, Thomas Ashton, Doctor of Divinity, sat in his study habited in a dressing gown, and with a silk cap on his shaven head, his wig being for the time taken off and placed on its block on a side table. He was a man of some 55 years, strongly made, of a sanguine complexion, an angry eye, and a long upper lip. Face and eye were lighted up at the moment, when I picture him by the level ray of an afternoon sun that shone in upon him through a tall sash window, giving on the west. The room into which it shone was also tall, lined with bookcases, and where the wall showed between them, panelled. On the table near the doctor's elbow was a green cloth, and upon it what he would have called a silver standish, a tray with inkstands, quill pens, a calf-bound book or two, some papers, a churchwarden pipe and brass tobacco box, a flask cased in plaited straw, and a liqueur glass. The year was 1730, the month December, the hour somewhat past 3 in the afternoon. I have described in these lines pretty much all that a superficial observer would have noted when he looked into the room. What met Dr. Ashton's eye when he looked out of it, sitting in his leather armchair? Little more than the tops of the shrubs and fruit trees of his garden could be seen from that point. But the red brick wall of it was visible in almost all the length of its western side. In the middle of that was a gate, a double gate of rather elaborate iron scroll work, which allowed something of a view beyond. Through it he could see that the ground sloped away almost at once to a bottom, along which a stream must run, and rose steeply from it on the other side, up to a field that was park-like in character, and thickly studded with oaks. Now, of course, leafless. They did not stand so thick together, but that some glimpse of sky and horizon could be seen between their stems. The sky was now golden, and the horizon, a horizon of distant woods, it seemed, was purple. But all that Dr. Ashton could find to say, after contemplating this prospect for many minutes, was abominable. A listener would have been aware, immediately upon this, of the sound of footsteps coming somewhat hurriedly in the direction of the study. By the resonance he could have told that they were traversing a much larger room. Dr. Ashton turned round in his chair as the door opened, and looked expectant. The incomer was a lady, a stout lady in the dress of the time, though I have made some attempt at indicating the doctor's costume. I will not enterprise that of his wife, for it was Mrs. Ashton who now entered. She had an anxious, even a sorely distracted look, and it was in a very disturbed voice that she almost whispered to Dr. Ashton, putting her head close to his. "He's in a very sad way, love, worse, I'm afraid." Is he really?" And he leaned back and looked in her face. She nodded. 2 solemn bells, high up and not far away, rang out the half-hour at this moment. Mrs. Ashton started. "Oh, do you think you can give order that the Minster clock be stopped chiming tonight? 'Tis just over his chamber, and will keep him from sleeping, and to sleep is the only chance for him, that's certain. Why, to be sure, if there were need, real need, it could be done, but not upon any light occasion. This Frank, now, do you assure me that his recovery stands upon it?" said Dr. Ashton. His voice was loud and rather hard. "I do verily believe it," said his wife. "Then, if it must be, bid Molly run across to Simpkins and say on my authority that he is to stop the clock chimes at sunset. And, yes, she is after that to say to my Lord Saul that I wish to see him presently in this room." Mrs. Ashton hurried off. Before any other visitor enters, it will be well to explain the situation. Dr. Ashton was the holder, among other preferments, of a prebend in the rich collegiate church of Whitminster, one of the foundations which, though not a cathedral, survived dissolution and reformation, and retained its constitution and endowments, for 100 years after the time of which I write. The great church, the residences of the dean and the two prebendaries, the choir and its appurtenances, were all intact and in working order. A dean who flourished soon after 1500s had been a great builder, and had erected a spacious quadrangle of red brick adjoining the church for the residence of the officials. Some of these persons were no longer required. Their offices had dwindled down to mere titles, borne by clergy or lawyers in the town and neighborhood, and so the houses that had been meant to accommodate 8 or 10 people were now shared among 3, the dean and the 2 prebendaries. Dr. Ashton's included what had been the common parlour and the dining hall of the whole body. It occupied a whole side of the court, and at one end had a private door into the minster. The other end, as we have seen, looked out over the country. So much for the house. As for the inmates, Dr. Ashton was a wealthy man and childless, and he adopted, or rather undertaken to bring up, the orphan son of his wife's sister. Frank Seddle was the lad's name. He had been a good many months in the house. Then one day came a letter from an Irish peer, the Earl of Kildonan, who had known Dr. Ashton at college, putting it to the doctor whether he would consider taking into his family the Viscount Saul, the Earl's heir, and acting in some sort as his tutor. Lord Kildonan was shortly to take up a post in the Lisbon embassy, and the boy was unfit to make the voyage. Not that he is sickly, the Earl wrote, though you'll find him whimsical, or of late I've thought him so, and to confirm this, 'twas only today his old nurse came expressly to tell me he was possessed. But let that pass. I'll warrant you can find a spell to make all straight. Your arm was stout enough in old days, and I give you plenary authority to use it as you see fit. The truth is, he has here no boys of his age or quality to consort with, and is given to moping about in our raths and graveyards, and he brings home romances that fright my servants out of their wits. So there are you and your lady forewarned. It was perhaps with half an eye open to the possibility of an Irish bishopric, at which another sentence in the Earl's letter seemed to hint that Dr. Ashton accepted the charge of my Lord Viscount Saul, and of the 200 guineas a year that were to come with him. So he came, one night in September. When he got out of the chaise that brought him, he went first and spoke to the postboy and gave him some money and patted the neck of his horse. Whether he made some movement that scared it or not, there was very nearly a nasty accident, for the beast started violently, and the postilion being unready was thrown and lost his fee, as he found afterwards. And the chaise lost some paint on the gate-posts, and the wheel went over the man's foot who was taking out the baggage. When Lord Saul came up the steps into the light of the lamp in the porch to be greeted by Dr. Ashton, he was seen to be a thin youth of, say, 16 years old, with straight black hair and the pale colouring that is common to such a figure. He took the accident and commotion calmly enough, and expressed a proper anxiety for the people who had been, or might have been, hurt. His voice was smooth and pleasant, and without any trace, curiously, of an Irish brogue. Frank Siddle was a younger boy, perhaps of 11 or 12, but Lord Saul did not for that reject his company. Frank was able to teach him various games he had not known in Ireland, and he was apt at learning them, apt too at his books, though he had had little or no regular teaching at home. It was not long before he was making a shift to puzzle out the inscriptions on the tombs in the minster, and he would often put a question to the doctor about the old books in the library that required some thought to answer. It is to be supposed that he made himself very agreeable to the servants, for within 10 days of his coming they were almost falling over each other in their efforts to oblige him. At the same time, Mrs. Ashton was rather put to it to find new maidservants, for there were several changes, and some of the families in the town from which she had been accustomed to draw seemed to have no one available. She was forced to go further afield than was usual. These generalities I gather from the doctor's notes in his diary and from letters. They are generalities, and we should like, in view of what has to be told, something sharper and more detailed. We get it in entries which begin late in the year, and, I think, were posted up altogether after the final incident. But they cover so few days in all that there is no need to doubt that the writer could remember the course of things accurately. On a Friday morning it was that a fox, or perhaps a cat, made away with Mrs. Ashton's most prized black cockerel, a bird without a single white feather on its body. Her husband had told her often enough that it would make a suitable sacrifice to Aesculapius, that had discomfited her much, and now she would hardly be consoled. The boys looked everywhere for traces of it. Lord Saul brought in a few feathers, which seemed to have been partially burnt on the garden rubbish heap. It was on the same day that Dr. Ashton, looking out of an upper window, saw the two boys playing in the corner of the garden at a game he did not understand. Frank was looking earnestly at something in the palm of his hand. Saul stood behind him and seemed to be listening. After some minutes he very gently laid his hand on Frank's head, and almost instantly thereupon, Frank suddenly dropped whatever it was that he was holding, clapped his hands to his eyes, and sank down on the grass. Saul, whose face expressed great anger, hastily picked the object up, of which it could only be seen that it was glittering, put it in his pocket, and turned away, leaving Frank huddled up on the grass. "Doctor." Ashton rapped on the window to attract their attention, and Saul looked up as if in alarm, and then springing to Frank, pulled him up by the arm and led him away. When they came in to dinner, Saul explained that they had been acting a part of the tragedy of Rhadamistus, in which the heroine reads the future fate of her father's kingdom by means of a glass ball held in her hand, and is overcome by the terrible events she has seen. During this explanation, Frank said nothing, only looked rather bewilderedly at Saul. He must, Mrs. Ashton thought, have contracted a chill from the wet of the grass. For that evening he was certainly feverish and disordered, and the disorder was of the mind as well as the body, for he seemed to have something he wished to say to Mrs. Ashton. Only a press of household affairs prevented her from paying attention to him, and when she went, according to her habit, to see that the light in the boys' chamber had been taken away, and to bid them good night, he seemed to be sleeping, though his face was unnaturally flushed. To her thinking, Lord Saul, however, was pale and quiet, and smiling in his slumber. Next morning it happened that Dr. Ashton was occupied in church and other business, and unable to take the boys' lessons. He therefore set them tasks to be written and brought to him. 3 times, if not oftener, Frank knocked at the study door, and each time the doctor chanced to be engaged with some visitor, and sent the boy off rather roughly, which he later regretted. 2 clergymen were at dinner this day, and both remarked, being fathers of families, that the lad seemed sickening for a fever, in which they were too near the truth, and it had been better if he had been put to bed forthwith, for a couple of hours later in the afternoon he came running into the house, crying out in a way that was really terrifying, and rushing to Mrs. Ashton, clung about her, begging her to protect him, and saying, keep them off, without intermission, and it was now evident that some sickness had taken strong hold of him. He was therefore got to bed in another chamber from that in which he commonly lay, and the physician brought to him, who pronounced the disorder to be grave and affecting the lad's brain, and prognosticated a fatal end to it if strict quiet were not observed, and those sedative remedies used which he should prescribe. We are now come by another way to the point we had reached before. The minster clock has been stopped from striking, and Lord Saul is on the threshold of the study. What account can you give of this poor lad's state? Was Dr. Ashton's first question. Why, sir, little more than you know already, I fancy. I must blame myself, though, for giving him a fright yesterday when we were acting that foolish play you saw. I fear I made him take it more to heart than I meant. How so? Well, by telling him foolish tales I had picked up in Ireland of what we call the second sight. Second sight? What kind of sight might that be? Why, you know our ignorant people pretend that some are able to foresee what is to come, sometimes in a glass or in the air, maybe. And at Kildernan, we had an old woman that pretended to such a power. And I dare say I coloured the matter more highly than I should, but I never dreamed Frank would take it so near as he did. You were wrong, my lord, very wrong, in meddling with such superstitious matters at all, and you should have considered whose house you were in, and how little becoming such actions are to my character and person or to your own. But pray how came it that you, acting, as you say, a play, should fall upon anything that could so alarm Frank? That is what I can hardly tell, sir. He passed all in a moment from rant about battles and lovers and Cleodora and Antigenas to something I could not follow at all, and then dropped down as you saw. Yes, was that at the moment when you laid your hand on the top of his head? Lord Saul gave a quick look at his questioner, quick and spiteful, and for the first time seemed unready with an answer. About that time it may have been, he said. I have tried to recollect myself, but I am not sure. There was at any rate no significance in what I did then. Ah, said Dr. Ashton. Well, my lord, I should do wrong were I not to tell you that this fright of my poor nephew may have very ill consequences to him. The doctor speaks very despondingly of his state. Lord Saul pressed his hands together and looked earnestly upon Dr. Ashton. I am willing to believe you had no bad intention, as assuredly you could have no reason to bear the poor boy malice, but I cannot wholly free you from blame in the affair. As he spoke, the hurrying steps were heard again, and Mrs. Ashton came quickly into the room, carrying a candle, for the evening had by this time closed in. She was greatly agitated. "Oh, come," she cried. "Come directly. I'm sure he is going." "Going, Frank? Is it possible? Already?" With some such incoherent words, the doctor caught up a book of prayers from the table and ran out after his wife. Lord Saul stopped for a moment where he was. Molly, the maid, saw him bend over and put both hands to his face. If it were the last words she had to speak, she said afterwards, he was striving to keep back a fit of laughing. Then he went out softly, following the others. Mrs. Ashton was sadly right in her forecast. I have no inclination to imagine the last scene in detail. What Dr. Ashton records is, or may be taken to be, important to the story. They asked Frank if he would like to see his companion, Lord Saul, once again. The boy was quite collected, it appears, in these moments. "No," he said, "I do not want to see him, but you should tell him I am afraid he will be very cold." "What do you mean, my dear?" said Mrs. Ashton. "Only that," said Frank. "But say to him besides that I am free of them now, but he should take care. And I am sorry about your black cockerel, Aunt Ashton, but he said we must use it so, if we were to see all that could be seen." Not many minutes after, he was gone. Both the Ashtons were grieved, she naturally most, but the doctor, though not an emotional man, felt the pathos of the early death. And besides, there was the growing suspicion that all had not been told him by Saul, and that there was something here which was out of his beaten track. When he left the chamber of death, it was to walk across the quadrangle of the residence to the sexton's house. A passing bell, the greatest of the Minster bells, must be rung, a grave must be dug in the Minster yard, and there was now no need to silence the chiming of the Minster clock. As he came slowly back in the dark, he thought he must see Lord Saul again. That matter of the black cockerel, trifling as it might seem, would have to be cleared up. It might be merely a fancy of the sick boy, but if not, was there not a witch trial he had read, in which some grim little rite of sacrifice had played a part? Yes, he must see Saul. I rather guess these thoughts of his than find written authority for them. That there was another interview is certain. Certain also that Saul would, or as he said, could, throw no light on Frank's words, though the message or some part of it appeared to affect him horribly. But there is no record of the talk in detail. It is only said that Saul sat all that evening in the study, and when he bid good night, which he did most reluctantly, asked for the doctor's prayers. The month of January was near its end when Lord Kildernan, in the embassy at Lisbon, received a letter that for once gravely disturbed that vain man and neglectful father. Saul was dead. The scene at Frank's burial had been very distressing. The day was awful in blackness and wind. The bearers, staggering blindly along under the flapping black pall, found it a hard job. When they emerged from the porch of the minster to make their way to the grave, Mrs. Ashton was in her room. Women did not then go to their kinsfolk's funerals, but Saul was there, draped in the mourning cloak of the time, and his face was white and fixed as that of one dead, except when, as was noticed 3 or 4 times, he suddenly turned his head to the left and looked over his shoulder. It was then alive with a terrible expression of listening fear. No one saw him go away, and no one could find him that evening. All night the gale buffeted the high windows of the church and howled over the upland and roared through the woodland. It was useless to search in the open. No voice of shouting or cry for help could possibly be heard. All that Dr. Ashton could do was to warn the people about the college and the town constables, and to sit up on the alert for any news, and this he did. News came early next morning, brought by the sexton, whose business it was to open the church for early prayers at 7, and who sent the maid rushing upstairs with wild eyes and flying hair to summon her master. The two men dashed across to the south door of the minster, there to find Lord Saul clinging desperately to the great ring of the door, his head sunk between his shoulders, his stockings in rags, his shoes gone, his legs torn and bloody. This was what had to be told to Lord Kildernan, and this really ends the first part of the story. The tomb of Frank Siddall and of the Lord Viscount Saul, only child and heir to William Earl of Kildernan, is a stone altar tomb in Whitminster churchyard. Dr. Ashton lived on for over 30 years in his prebendal house. I do not know how quietly, but without visible disturbance. His successor preferred a house he already owned in the town, and left that of the senior prebendary vacant. Between them, these two men saw the 18th century out and the 19th in, for Mr. Hindies, the successor of Ashton, became prebendary at 29 and died at 89. So that it was not till 1823 or 1824 that anyone succeeded to the post who intended to make the house his home. The man who did was Dr. Henry Oldies, whose name may be known to some of my readers as that of the author of a row of volumes labelled Oldies's Works, which occupy a place that must be honoured, since it is so rarely touched. Upon the shelves of many a substantial library, Dr. Oldies, his niece, and his servants took some months to transfer furniture and books from his Dorsetshire parsonage to the quadrangle of Whitminster, and to get everything into place. But eventually the work was done, and the house which, though untenanted, had always been kept sound and weather-tight, woke up, and like Monte Cristo's mansion at Auteuil, lived, sang, and bloomed once more. On a certain morning in June, it looked especially fair, as Dr. Oldies strolled in his garden before breakfast and gazed over the red roof at the Minster Tower, with its 4 gold vanes, backed by a very blue sky, and very white little clouds. "Mary," he said, as he seated himself at the breakfast table and laid down something hard and shiny on the cloth, "here's a find which the boy made just now. You'll be sharper than I if you can guess what it's meant for." It was a round and perfectly smooth tablet, as much as an inch thick, of what seemed clear glass. "It is rather attractive at all events," said Mary. She was a fair woman, with light hair and large eyes, rather a devotee of literature. "Yes," said her uncle, "I thought you'd be pleased with it. I presume it came from the house. It turned up in the rubbish heap in the corner." "I'm not sure that I do like it after all," said Mary some minutes later. "Why in the world not, my dear?" "I don't know, I'm sure. Perhaps it's only fancy." "Yes, only fancy and romance, of course. What's that book now, the name of that book, I mean, that you had your head in all yesterday?" "The Talisman, uncle." "Oh, if this should turn out to be a talisman, how enchanting it would be." "Yes, the Talisman. Well, you're welcome to it. Whatever it is, I must be off about my business. Is all well in the house? Does it suit you? Any complaints from the servants' hall?" "No, indeed, nothing could be more charming. The only soup-con of a complaint besides the lock of the linen closet, which I told you of, is that Mrs. Maple says she cannot get rid of the sawflies out of that room you pass through at the other end of the hall. By the way, are you sure you like your bedroom? It is a long way off from anyone else, you know." "Like it? To be sure I do. The further off from you, my dear, the better. There, don't think it necessary to beat me, accept my apologies. But what are sawflies? Will they eat my coats? If not, they may have the room to themselves for what I care. We are not likely to be using it." "No, of course not. Well, what she calls sawflies are those reddish things like a daddy-long-legs, but smaller. And there are a great many of them perching about that room, certainly. I don't like them, but I don't fancy they are mischievous." "There seem to be several things you don't like this fine morning," said her uncle, as he closed the door. Miss Oldies remained in her chair looking at the tablet, which she was holding in the palm of her hand. The smile that had been on her face faded slowly from it, and gave place to an expression of curiosity and almost strained attention. Her reverie was broken by the entrance of Mrs. Maple and her invariable opening, "Oh, miss, could I speak to you a minute?" A letter from Miss Oldies to a friend in Lichfield, begun a day or two before, is the next source for this story. It is not devoid of traces of the influence of that leader of female thought in her day, Miss Anna Seward, known to some as the Swan of Lichfield. My sweetest Emily will be rejoiced to hear that we are at length, my beloved uncle and myself, settled in the house that now calls us master, nay master and mistress, as in past ages it has called so many others. Here we taste a mingling of modern elegance and hoary antiquity, such as has never ere now graced life for either of us. The town, small as it is, affords us some reflection, pale indeed, but veritable, of the sweets of polite intercourse. The adjacent country numbers amid the occupants of its scattered mansions, some whose polish is annually refreshed by contact with metropolitan splendor, and others whose robust and homely geniality is, at times, and by way of contrast, not less cheering and acceptable. Tired of the parlors and drawing-rooms of our friends, we have ready to hand a refuge from the clash of wits, or the small talk of the day, amid the solemn beauties of our venerable minster, whose sylvan chimes daily knoll us to prayer, and in the shady walks of whose tranquil graveyard we muse with softened heart, and ever and anon with moistened eye, upon the memorials of the young, the beautiful, the aged, the wise, and the good. Here there is an abrupt break both in the writing and the style. But, my dearest Emily, I can no longer write with the care which you deserve, and in which we both take pleasure. What I have to tell you is wholly foreign to what has gone before. This morning my uncle brought in to breakfast an object which had been found in the garden. It was a glass or crystal tablet of this shape. A little sketch is given, which he handed to me, and which, after he left the room, remained on the table by me. I gazed at it, I know not why, for some minutes, till called away by the day's duties, and you will smile incredulously when I say that I seemed to myself to begin to descry, reflected in it, objects and scenes which were not in the room where I was. You will not, however, be surprised that after such an experience I took the first opportunity to seclude myself in my room with what I now half believe to be a talisman of mickle might. I was not disappointed. I assure you, Emily, by that memory which is dearest to both of us, that what I went through this afternoon transcends the limits of what I had before deemed credible. In brief, what I saw, seated in my bedroom, in the broad daylight of summer, and looking into the crystal depth of that small round tablet, was this. First, a prospect, strange to me, of an enclosure of rough and hillocky grass, with a grey stone ruin in the midst, and a wall of rough stones about it. In this stood an old and very ugly woman in a red cloak and ragged skirt, talking to a boy dressed in the fashion of maybe 100 years ago. She put something which glittered into his hand, and he something into hers, which I saw to be money, for a single coin fell from her trembling hand into the grass. The scene passed. I should have remarked, by the way, that on the rough walls of the enclosure I could distinguish bones and even a skull lying in a disorderly fashion. Next I was looking upon two boys, one the figure of the former vision, the other younger. They were in a plot of garden, walled round, and this garden, in spite of the difference in arrangement, and the small size of the trees, I could clearly recognize as being that upon which I now look from my window. The boys were engaged in some curious play, it seemed. Something was smouldering on the ground. The elder placed his hands upon it and then raised them in what I took to be an attitude of prayer, and I saw, and started at seeing, that on them were deep stains of blood. The sky above was overcast. The same boy now turned his face towards the wall of the garden and beckoned with both his raised hands. And as he did so, I was conscious that some moving objects were becoming visible over the top of the wall. Whether heads or other parts of some animal or human forms, I could not tell. Upon the instant, the elder boy turned sharply, seized the arm of the younger, who all this time had been poring over what lay on the ground, and both hurried off. I then saw blood upon the grass, a little pile of bricks, and what I thought were black feathers scattered about. That scene closed, and the next was so dark that perhaps the full meaning of it escaped me. But what I seemed to see was a form, at first crouching low among trees or bushes that were being threshed by a violent wind, then running very swiftly, and constantly turning a pale face to look behind him, as if he feared a pursuer, and indeed, pursuers were following hard after him. Their shapes were but dimly seen, their number, 3 or 4 perhaps only guessed. I suppose they were on the whole more like dogs than anything else, but dogs such as we have seen they assuredly were not. Could I have closed my eyes to this horror, I would have done so at once, but I was helpless. The last I saw was the victim darting beneath an arch and clutching at some object to which he clung, and those that were pursuing him overtook him, and I seemed to hear the echo of a cry of despair. It may be that I became unconscious. Certainly I had the sensation of awaking to the light of day after an interval of darkness. Such, in literal truth, Emily, was my vision, I can call it by no other name, of this afternoon. Tell me, have I not been the unwilling witness of some episode of a tragedy connected with this very house? The letter is continued next day. The tale of yesterday was not completed when I laid down my pen. I said nothing of my experiences to my uncle. You know yourself how little his robust common sense would be prepared to allow of them, and how in his eyes the specific remedy would be a black draught or a glass of port. After a silent evening, then, silent, not sullen, I retired to rest. Judge of my terror, when, not yet in bed, I heard what I can only describe as a distant bellow, and knew it for my uncle's voice, though never in my hearing so exerted before. His sleeping room is at the further extremity of this large house, and to gain access to it one must traverse an antique hall some 80 feet long and a lofty panelled chamber and 2 unoccupied bedrooms. In the second of these, a room almost devoid of furniture, I found him, in the dark, his candle lying smashed on the floor. As I ran in, bearing a light, he clasped me in arms that trembled for the first time since I have known him, thanked God, and hurried me out of the room. He would say nothing of what had alarmed him. Tomorrow, tomorrow, was all I could get from him. A bed was hastily improvised for him in the room next to my own. I doubt if his night was more restful than mine. I could only get to sleep in the small hours when daylight was already strong, and then my dreams were of the grimmest, particularly one which stamped itself on my brain, and which I must set down on the chance of dispersing the impression it has made. It was that I came up to my room with a heavy foreboding of evil oppressing me, and went with a hesitation and reluctance I could not explain to my chest of drawers. I opened the top drawer, in which was nothing but ribbons and handkerchiefs, and then the second, where was as little to alarm, and then, oh heavens, the third and last, and there was a mass of linen neatly folded, upon which, as I looked with curiosity that began to be tinged with horror, I perceived a movement in it, and a pink hand was thrust out of the folds and began to grope feebly in the air. I could bear it no more, and rushed from the room, clapping the door after me, and strove with all my force to lock it. But the key would not turn in the wards, and from within the room came a sound of rustling and bumping, drawing nearer and nearer to the door. Why I did not flee down the stairs I know not. I continued grasping the handle, and mercifully, as the door was plucked from my hand with an irresistible force, I awoke. You may not think this very alarming, but I assure you it was so to me. At breakfast today my uncle was very uncommunicative, and I think ashamed of the fright he had given us, but afterwards he inquired of me whether Mr. Spearman was still in town, adding that he thought that was a young man who had some sense left in his head. I think you know, my dear Emily, that I am not inclined to disagree with him there, and also that I was not unlikely to be able to answer his question. To Mr. Spearman he accordingly went, and I have not seen him since. I must send this strange budget of news to you now, or it may have to wait over more than one post. The reader will not be far out if he guesses that Miss Mary and Mr. Spearman made a match of it not very long after this month of June. Mr. Spearman was a young spark who had a good property in the neighbourhood of Whitminster, and not unfrequently about this time spent a few days at the King's Head, ostensibly on business. But he must have had some leisure, for his diary is copious, especially for the days of which I am telling the story. It is probable to me that he wrote this episode as fully as he could at the bidding of Miss Mary. Uncle Oldie's how I hope I may have the right to call him so before long called this morning. After throwing out a good many short remarks on indifferent topics, he said, "I wish, Spearman, you'd listen to an odd story and keep a close tongue about it just for a bit, till I get more light on it." "To be sure," said I, "you may count on me." "I don't know what to make of it," he said. "You know my bedroom. It is well away from everyone else's, and I pass through the great hall and 2 or 3 other rooms to get to it." "Is it at the end next the minster, then?" I asked. "Yes, it is. Well, now, yesterday morning my Mary told me that the room next before it was infested with some sort of fly that the housekeeper couldn't get rid of. That may be the explanation, or it may not. What do you think?" "Why," said I, "you've not yet told me what has to be explained." "True enough, I don't believe I have, but by the by, what are these sawflies? What's the size of them?" I began to wonder if he was touched in the head. "What I call a sawfly," I said very patiently, "is a red animal, like a daddy-long-legs, but not so big, perhaps an inch long, perhaps less. It is very hard in the body, and to me I was going to say particularly offensive, but he broke in, 'Come, an inch or less. That won't do.' 'I can only tell you,' I said, 'what I know. Would it not be better if you told me from first to last what it is that has puzzled you? And then I may be able to give you some kind of an opinion.' He gazed at me meditatively. 'Perhaps it would,' he said. 'I told Mary only today that I thought you had some vestiges of sense in your head.' I bowed my acknowledgments. 'The thing is, I've an odd kind of shyness about talking of it. Nothing of the sort has happened to me before. Well, about 11 o'clock last night, or after, I took my candle and set out for my room. I had a book in my other hand. I always read something for a few minutes before I drop off to sleep. A dangerous habit. I don't recommend it, but I know how to manage my light and my bed curtains. Now then, first, as I stepped out of my study into the great hearth that's next to it, and shut the door, my candle went out. I supposed I had clapped the door behind me too quick and made a draught, and I was annoyed, for I'd no tinder box nearer than my bedroom. But I knew my way well enough, and went on. The next thing was that my book was struck out of my hand in the dark. If I said twitched out of my hand, it would better express the sensation. It fell on the floor. I picked it up and went on, more annoyed than before, and a little startled. But as you know, that hall has many windows without curtains, and in summer nights like these it is easy to see not only where the furniture is, but whether there's anyone or anything moving. And there was no one, nothing of the kind. So on I went through the hall and through the audit chamber next to it, which also has big windows, and then into the bedrooms which lead to my own, where the curtains were drawn. And I had to go slower because of steps here and there. It was in the second of those rooms that I nearly got my quietus. The moment I opened the door of it, I felt there was something wrong. I thought twice, I confess, whether I shouldn't turn back and find another way there is to my room, rather than go through that one. Then I was ashamed of myself, and thought what people call better of it, though I don't know about better in this case. If I was to describe my experience exactly, I should say this. There was a dry, light, rustling sound all over the room as I went in, and then you remember it was perfectly dark. Something seemed to rush at me, and there was, I don't know how to put it, a sensation of long, thin arms, or legs, or feelers, all about my face, and neck, and body. Very little strength in them, there seemed to be. But Spearman, I don't think I was ever more horrified or disgusted in all my life, that I remember, and it does take something to put me out. I roared out as loud as I could, and flung away my candle at random, and knowing I was near the window. I tore at the curtain and somehow let in enough light to be able to see something waving, which I knew was an insect's leg by the shape of it. But Lord, what a size! Why, the beast must have been as tall as I am. And now you tell me sawflies are an inch long or less. What do you make of it, Spearman? For goodness sake, finish your story first, I said. I never heard anything like it. Oh, said he, there's no more to tell. Mary ran in with a light and there was nothing there. I didn't tell her what was the matter. I changed my room for last night and I expect for good. Have you searched this odd room of yours? I said. What do you keep in it? We don't use it, he answered. There's an old press there and some little other furniture. And in the press, said I don't know, I never saw it opened, but I do know that it's locked. Well, I should have it looked into, and if you had time, I own to having some curiosity to see the place myself. I didn't exactly like to ask you, but that's rather what I hoped you'd say. Name your time, and I'll take you there. No time like the present, I said at once, for I saw he would never settle down to anything while this affair was in suspense. He got up with great alacrity and looked at me, I am tempted to think, with marked approval. Come along, was all he said, however, and was pretty silent all the way to his house. My Mary, as he calls her in public and I in private, was summoned, and we proceeded to the room. The doctor had gone so far as to tell her that he had had something of a fright there last night. Of what nature he had not yet divulged, but now he pointed out and described, very briefly, the incidents of his progress. When we were near the important spot, he pulled up and allowed me to pass on. There's the room, he said. Go in, Spearman, and tell us what you find. Whatever I might have felt at midnight, noonday I was sure would keep back anything sinister, and I flung the door open with an air and stepped in. It was a well-lighted room, with its large window on the right, though not, I thought, a very airy one. The principal piece of furniture was the gaunt old press of dark wood. There was, too, a four-post bedstead, a mere skeleton which could hide nothing, and there was a chest of drawers. On the window-sill and the floor near it were the dead bodies of many hundred sawflies, and one torpid one which I had some satisfaction in killing. I tried the door of the press, but could not open it. The drawers, too, were locked. Somewhere, I was conscious, there was a faint rustling sound, but I could not locate it, and when I made my report to those outside, I said nothing of it. But, I said, clearly the next thing was to see what was in those locked receptacles. Uncle Oldys turned to Mary. Mrs. Maple, he said, and Mary ran off, no one, I am sure, steps like her, and soon came back at a soberer pace with an elderly lady of discreet aspect. Have you the keys of these things, Mrs. Maple? Said Uncle Oldys. His simple words let loose a torrent not violent but copious of speech. Had she been a shade or two higher in the social scale, Mrs. Maple might have stood as the model for Miss Bates. Oh, Doctor, and Miss, and you too, sir, she said, acknowledging my presence with a bend. Them keys. Who was that again that come when first we took over things in this house? A gentleman in business it was. And I gave him his luncheon in the small parlour, on account of us not having everything as we should like to see it in the large one. Chicken, an apple pie, and a glass of Madeira. Dear, dear, you'll say I'm running on, Miss Mary, but I only mention it to bring back my recollection, and there it comes. Gardner, just the same as it did last week with the artichokes and the text of the sermon. Now that Mr. Gardner, every key I got from him were labelled to itself, and each and every one was a key of some door or another in this house, and sometimes two. And when I say door, my meaning is door of a room, not like such a press as this is. Yes, Miss Mary, I know full well, and I'm just making it clear to your uncle, and you too, sir. But now there was a box which this same gentleman he give over into my charge, and thinking no harm after he was gone, I took the liberty, knowing it was your uncle's property, to rattle it. And unless I'm most surprisingly deceived, in that box there was keys, but what keys that, Doctor, is known elsewhere, for open the box. No, that I would not do. I wondered that Uncle Oldys remained as quiet as he did under this address. Mary, I knew, was amused by it, and he probably had been taught by experience that it was useless to break in upon it. At any rate, he did not, but merely said at the end, "Have you that box handy, Mrs. Maple? If so, you might bring it here." Mrs. Maple pointed her finger at him, either in accusation or in gloomy triumph. "There," she said, "was I to choose out the very words out of your mouth, doctor, them would be the ones. And if I've took it to my own rebuke 1/2 times, it's been nearer 50. Laid awake I have in my bed, sat down in my chair I have, the same you and Miss Mary gave me the day I was 20 year in your service. And no person could desire a better. Yes, Miss Mary, but it is the truth, and well we know who it is would have it different if he could. All very well, says I to myself, but pray, when the doctor calls you to account for that box, what are you going to say? No, doctor, if you was some masters I've heard of and I was some servants I could name, I should have an easy task before me, but things being, humanly speaking, what they are, the one course open to me is just to say to you that without Miss Mary comes to my room and helps me to my recollection, which her wits may manage what's slipped beyond mine, no such box as that, small though it be, will cross your eyes this many a day to come." "Why, dear Mrs. Maple, why didn't you tell me before that you wanted me to help you to find it?" said my Mary. "No, never mind telling me why it was. Let us come at once and look for it." They hastened off together. I could hear Mrs. Maple beginning an explanation which, I doubt not, lasted into the furthest recesses of the housekeeper's department. Uncle Oldys and I were left alone. "A valuable servant," he said, nodding towards the door. "Nothing goes wrong under her. The speeches are seldom over 3 minutes." "How will Miss Oldys manage to make her remember about the box?" I asked. Mary: "Oh, she'll make her sit down and ask her about her aunt's last illness, or who gave her the china dog on the mantelpiece, something quite off the point. Then, as Maple says, one thing brings up another, and the right one will come round sooner than you could suppose. There, I believe I hear them coming back already." It was indeed so, and Mrs. Maple was hurrying on ahead of Mary with the box in her outstretched hand and a beaming face. "What was it?" she cried as she drew near. "What was it, as I said, before ever I come out of Dorsetshire to this place? Not that I'm a Dorset woman myself, nor had need to be. Safe bind, safe find, and there it was in the place where I'd put it, 2 months back, I dare say." She handed it to Uncle Oldys, and he and I examined it with some interest, so that I ceased to pay attention to Mrs. Ann Maple for the moment, though I know that she went on to expound exactly where the box had been, and in what way Mary had helped to refresh her memory on the subject. It was an oldish box, tied with pink tape and sealed, and on the lid was pasted a label inscribed in old ink, "The Senior Prebendary's House, Whitminster." On being opened, it was found to contain 2 keys of moderate size, and a paper, on which, in the same hand as the label, was keys of the press and box of drawers standing in the disused chamber. Also this: "The effects in this press and box are held by me, and to be held by my successors in the residence, in trust for the noble family of Kildernon, if claim be made by any survivor of it. I, having made all the inquiry possible to myself, am of the opinion that that noble house is wholly extinct, the last earl having been, as is notorious, cast away at sea, and his only child and heir deceased in my house. The papers as to which melancholy casualty were by me reposed in the same press in this year of our Lord, 1753. 21. March. I am further of opinion that unless grave discomfort arise, such persons, not being of the family of Kildernon, as shall become possessed of these keys, will be well advised to leave matters as they are, which opinion I do not express without weighty and sufficient reason, and am happy to have my judgment confirmed by the other members of this college and church, who are conversant with the events referred to in this paper, though Ashton, S.T.P., Prabe, Senna, Will Blake, S.T.P., Decanus, Hen Goodman, S.T.B., Prabe Jun. "Ah," said Uncle Oldys, "grave discomfort. So he thought there might be something. I suspect it was that young man," he went on, pointing with the key to the line about the only child and heir. Mary? The Viscounty of... Kildonan was Saul." "How do you know that, Uncle?" said Mary. "Oh, why not? It's all in Debrett, 2 little fat books. But I meant the tomb by the lime walk. He's there. What's the story, I wonder? Do you know it, Mrs. Maple? And by the way, look at your sawflies by the window there." Mrs. Maple, thus confronted with 2 subjects at once, was a little put to it to do justice to both. It was no doubt rash in Uncle Oldie's to give her the opportunity. I could only guess that he had some slight hesitation about using the key he held in his hand. Oh, them flies. How bad they was, Doctor and Miss, this 3 or 4 days. And you too, sir, you wouldn't guess, none of you. And how they come to. First we took the room in hand, the shutters was up, and had been, I dare say, years upon years and not a fly to be seen. Then we got the shutter bars down with a deal of trouble, and left it so for the day, and next day I sent Susan in with a broom to sweep about, and not 2 minutes hadn't passed when out she come into the hall like a blind thing. And we had regular to beat them off her. Why, her cap, and her hair, you couldn't see the colour of it, I do assure you, and all clustering round her eyes too. Fortunate enough she's not a girl with fancies, else if it had been me, why only the tickling of the nasty things would have drove me out of my wits. And now there they lay like so many dead things. Well, they was lively enough on the Monday, and now here's Thursday, is it, or no, Friday, only to come near the door, and you'd hear them pattering up against it, and once you opened it, dash at you, they would, as if they'd eat you. I couldn't help thinking to myself, if you was bats, where should we be this night? Nor you can't crash 'em, not like a usual kind of a fly. Well, there's something to be thankful for, if we could but learn by it. And then this tomb, too, she said, hastening on to her second point to elude any chance of interruption. Of them 2 poor young lads. I say poor, and yet when I recollect myself, I was at tea with Mrs. Simpkins, the sexton's wife, before you come, Doctor and Miss Mary, and that's a family has been in the place, what? I dare say 100 years in that very house, and could put their hand on any tomb or yet grave in all the yard, and give you name and age. And his account of that young man, Mr. Simpkins's, I mean to say, well, she compressed her lips and nodded several times. "Tell us, Mrs. Maple," said Mary. "Go on," said Uncle Oldys. "What about him?" said I. "Never was such a thing seen in this place, not since Queen Mary's times and the Pope and all," said Mrs. Maple. "Why, do you know he lived in this very house, him and them that was with him, and for all I can tell in this identical room." She shifted her feet uneasily on the floor. "Who was with him? Do you mean the people of the house?" said Uncle Oldys suspiciously. "Not to call people, Doctor dear, no," was the answer. "More what he brought with him from Ireland, I believe it was. No, the people in the house was the last to hear anything of his goings-on, but in the town not a family, but knew how he stopped out at night. And them that was with him, why they were such as would strip the skin from the child in its grave, and a withered heart makes an ugly thin ghost," says Mr. Simpkins. "But they turned on him at the last," he says, "and there's the mark still to be seen on the minster door where they run him down. And that's no more than the truth, for I got him to show it to myself, and that's what he said. A lord he was, with a Bible name of a wicked king, whatever his godfathers could have been thinking of." "Saul was the name," said Uncle Oldys. "To be sure it was Saul, Doctor, and thank you. And now isn't it King Saul that we read of raising up the dead ghost that was slumbering in its tomb till he disturbed it? And isn't that a strange thing? This young lord to have such a name, and Mr. Simpkins's grandfather to see him out of his window of a dark night, going about from one grave to another in the yard with a candle, and them that was with him following through the grass at his heels, and one night him to come right up to old Mr. Simpkins's window that gives on the yard, and press his face up against it to find out if there was anyone in the room that could see him, and only just time there was for old Mr. Simpkins to drop down like quiet just under the window and hold his breath, and not stir till he heard him stepping away again. And this rustling like in the grass after him as he went, and then when he looked out of his window in the morning, there was treadings in the grass and a dead man's bone. Oh, he was a cruel child for certain, but he had to pay in the end, and after. After, said Uncle Oldys with a frown. Oh yes, Doctor. Night after night in old Mr. Simpkins's time. And his son. That's our Mr. Simpkins's father, yes. And our own Mr. Simpkins too. Up against that same window, particular when they've had a fire of a chilly evening, with his face right on the panes, and his hands fluttering out, and his mouth open and shut, for a minute or more, and then gone off in the dark yard. But open the window at such times, no, that they dare not do, though they could find it in their heart to pity the poor thing, that pinched up with the cold, and seemingly fading away to a nothing as the years passed on. Well, indeed, I believe it is no more than the truth what our Mr. Simpkins says on his own grandfather's word, a withered heart makes an ugly thin ghost. I dare say, said Uncle Oldys suddenly, so suddenly that Mrs. Maple stopped short. Thank you. Come away, all of you. Why, said Mary, are you not going to open the press after all? Uncle Oldys blushed, actually blushed. My dear, he said, you are at liberty to call me a coward, or applaud me as a prudent man, whichever you please. But I am neither going to open that press, nor that chest of drawers myself, nor am I going to hand over the keys to you or to any other person. Mrs. Maple, will you kindly see about getting a man or two to move those pieces of furniture into the garret? And when they do it, Mrs. Maple, said Mary, who seemed to me, I did not then know why, more relieved than disappointed by her uncle's decision. I have something that I want put with the rest, only quite a small packet. We left that curious room not unwillingly, I think. Uncle Oldys's orders were carried out that same day. And so, concludes Mr. Spearman, Whitminster has a Bluebeard's chamber, and I am rather inclined to suspect a jack-in-the-box, awaiting some future occupant of the residence of the senior prebendary. Chapter 2. The Diary of Mr. Pointer. The sale room of an old and famous firm of book auctioneers in London is, of course, a great meeting place for collectors, librarians, dealers, not only when an auction is in progress, but perhaps even more notably when books that are coming on for sale are upon view. It was in such a sale room that the remarkable series of events began, which were detailed to me not many months ago by the person whom they principally affected, namely Mr. James Denton, Ma, FSA, etc., etc. Some time of Trinity Hall now, or lately, of Rendcombe Manor in the county of Warwick. He, on a certain spring day not many years since, was in London for a few days, upon business connected principally with the furnishing of the house which he had just finished building at Rendcombe. It may be a disappointment to you to learn that Rendcombe Manor was new, that I cannot help. There had, no doubt, been an old house, but it was not remarkable for beauty or interest. Even had it been, neither beauty nor interest would have enabled it to resist the disastrous fire which about a couple of years before the date of my story had razed it to the ground. I am glad to say that all that was most valuable in it had been saved, and that it was fully insured, so that it was with a comparatively light heart that Mr. Denton was able to face the task of building a new and considerably more convenient dwelling for himself and his aunt, who constituted his whole menage. Being in London, with time on his hands, and not far from the sale room at which I have obscurely hinted, Mr. Denton thought that he would spend an hour there upon the chance of finding, among that portion of the famous Thomas collection of MSS, which he knew to be then on view, something bearing upon the history or topography of his part of Warwickshire. He turned in accordingly, purchased a catalogue and ascended to the sale room, where, as usual, the books were disposed in cases and some laid out upon the long tables. At the shelves, or sitting about at the tables, were figures, many of whom were familiar to him. He exchanged nods and greetings with several, and then settled down to examine his catalogue and note likely items. He had made good progress through about 200 of the 500 lots, every now and then rising to take a volume from the shelf and give it a cursory glance, when a hand was laid on his shoulder, and he looked up. His interrupter was one of those intelligent men with a pointed beard and a flannel shirt, of whom the last quarter of the 19th century was, it seems to me, very prolific. It is no part of my plan to repeat the whole conversation which ensued between the two. I must content myself with stating that it largely referred to common acquaintances, e.g., to the nephew of Mr. Denton's friend who had recently married and settled in Chelsea, to the sister-in-law of Mr. Denton's friend who had been seriously indisposed but was now better, and to a piece of china which Mr. Denton's friend had purchased some months before at a price much below its true value, from which you will rightly infer that the conversation was rather in the nature of a monologue. In due time, however, the friend bethought himself that Mr. Denton was there for a purpose, and said he, "What are you looking out for in particular?" "I don't think there's much in this lot." "Why?" "I thought there might be some Warwickshire collections, but I don't see anything under Warwick in the catalogue." "No, apparently not," said the friend. "All the same, I believe I noticed something like a Warwickshire diary." "What was the name again?" "Drayton, Potter, Painter. Either a P or a D, I feel sure." He turned over the leaves quickly. "Yes, here it is. Pointer. Lot 486. That might interest you. There are the books, I think, out on the table. Someone has been looking at them. Well, I must be getting on. Goodbye, you'll look us up, won't you? Couldn't you come this afternoon? We've got a little music about 4. Well then, when you're next in town." He went off. Mr. Denton looked at his watch and found to his confusion that he could spare no more than a moment before retrieving his luggage and going for the train. The moment was just enough to show him that there were 4 largish volumes of the diary, that it concerned the years about 1710, and that there seemed to be a good many insertions in it of various kinds. It seemed quite worthwhile to leave a commission of £25 for it, and this he was able to do, for his usual agent entered the room as he was on the point of leaving it. That evening, he rejoined his aunt at their temporary abode, which was a small dower house not many 100 yards from the manor. On the following morning, the two resumed a discussion that had now lasted for some weeks as to the equipment of the new house. Mr. Denton laid before his relative a statement of the results of his visit to town, particulars of carpets, of chairs, of wardrobes, and of bedroom china. "Yes, dear," said his aunt, "but I don't see any chintzes here. Did you go to—" Mr. Denton stamped on the floor. Where else indeed could he have stamped? Oh dear, he said. "The one thing I missed. I am sorry. The fact is I was on my way there, and I happened to be passing Robbins's." His aunt threw up her hands. "Robbins's? Then the next thing will be another parcel of horrible old books at some outrageous price. I do think, James, when I am taking all this trouble for you, you might contrive to remember the 1 or 2 things which I specially begged you to see after. It's not as if I was asking it for myself. I don't know whether you think I get any pleasure out of it, but if so, I can assure you it's very much the reverse. The thought and worry and trouble I have over it you have no idea of, and you have simply to go to the shops and order the things." Mr. Denton interposed a moan of penitence. "Oh, Aunt. Yes, that's all very well, dear, and I don't want to speak sharply, but you must know how very annoying it is, particularly as it delays the whole of our business. For I can't tell how long. Here is Wednesday. The Simpsons come tomorrow, and you can't leave them. Then on Saturday we have friends, as you know, coming for tennis. Yes, indeed, you spoke of asking them yourself, but of course I had to write the notes, and it is ridiculous, James, to look like that. We must occasionally be civil to our neighbours. You wouldn't like to have it said we were perfect bears. What was I saying? Well, anyhow, it comes to this, that it must be Thursday in next week at least, before you can go to town again. And until we have decided upon the chintzes, it is impossible to settle upon one single other thing." Mr. Denton ventured to suggest that as the paint and wallpapers had been dealt with, this was too severe a view, but this his aunt was not prepared to admit at the moment. Nor indeed was there any proposition he could have advanced which she would have found herself able to accept. However, as the day went on, she receded a little from this position, examined with lessening disfavour the samples and price lists submitted by her nephew, and even in some cases gave a qualified approval to his choice. As for him, he was naturally somewhat dashed by the consciousness of duty unfulfilled, but more so by the prospect of a lawn tennis party, which, though an inevitable evil in August, He had thought there was no occasion to fear in May, but he was to some extent cheered by the arrival on the Friday morning of an intimation that he had secured at the price of £12.10, the 4 volumes of Pointer's manuscript diary, and still more by the arrival on the next morning of the diary itself. The necessity of taking Mr. and Mrs. Simpson for a drive in the car on Saturday morning, and of attending to his neighbours and guests that afternoon, prevented him from doing more than open the parcel until the party had retired to bed on the Saturday night. It was then that he made certain of the fact, which he had before only suspected, that he had indeed acquired the diary of Mr. William Pointer, Squire of Accrington, about 4 miles from his own parish, that same Pointer, who was for a time a member of the circle of Oxford antiquaries, the centre of which was Thomas Hearne, and with whom Hearne seems ultimately to have quarrelled, a not uncommon episode in the career of that excellent man. As is the case with Hearne's own collections, the diary of Pointer contained a good many notes from printed books, descriptions of coins and other antiquities that had been brought to his notice, and drafts of letters on these subjects, besides the chronicle of everyday events. The description in the sale catalogue had given Mr. Denton no idea of the amount of interest which seemed to lie in the book, and he sat up reading in the first of the 4 volumes until a reprehensibly late hour. On the Sunday morning after church, his aunt came into the study and was diverted from what she had been going to say to him by the sight of the 4 brown leather quartos on the table. "What are these?" she said suspiciously. "New, aren't they? Oh, are these the things that made you forget my chintzes? I thought so. Disgusting. What did you give for them, I should like to know?" "Over £10. James, it is really sinful. Well, if you have money to throw away on this kind of thing, there can be no reason why you should not subscribe, and subscribe handsomely, to my Anti-Vivisection League. There is not indeed, James, and I shall be very seriously annoyed if—" "Who did you say wrote them?" "Old Mr. Pointer, of Accrington." "Well, of course, there is some interest in getting together old papers about this neighbourhood, but £10? She picked up one of the volumes, not that which her nephew had been reading, and opened it at random, dashing it to the floor the next instant with a cry of disgust as an earwig fell from between the pages. Mr. Denton picked it up with a smothered expletive and said, "Poor book. I think you're rather hard on Mr. Pointer." "Was I, my dear? I beg his pardon, but you know I cannot abide those horrid creatures. Let me see if I've done any mischief. No, I think all's well, but look here what you've opened him on. Dear me, yes, to be sure. How very interesting. Do unpin it, James, and let me look at it." It was a piece of patterned stuff about the size of the quarto page, to which it was fastened by an old-fashioned pin. James detached it and handed it to his aunt, carefully replacing the pin in the paper. Now, I do not know exactly what the fabric was, but it had a design printed upon it, which completely fascinated Miss Denton. She went into raptures over it, held it against the wall, made James do the same, that she might retire to contemplate it from a distance, then pored over it at close quarters, and ended her examination by expressing in the warmest terms her appreciation of the taste of the ancient Mr. Pointer, who had had the happy idea of preserving this sample in his diary. "It is a most charming pattern," she said, "and remarkable too. Look, James, how delightfully the lines ripple. It reminds one of hair, very much, doesn't it? And then these knots of ribbon, at intervals. They give just the relief of colour that is wanted. I wonder—" "I was going to say," said James with deference, "I wonder if it would cost much to have it copied for our curtains." "Copied? How could you have it copied, James?" "Well, I don't know the details, but I suppose that is a printed pattern, and that you could have a block cut from it in wood or metal. Now really, that is a capital idea, James. I am almost inclined to be glad that you forgot the chintzes on Monday. At any rate, I'll promise to forgive and forget if you get this lovely old thing copied. No one will have anything in the least like it, and mind, James, we won't allow it to be sold. Now I must go. And I've totally forgotten what it was I came in to say. Never mind, it'll keep." After his aunt had gone, James Denton devoted a few minutes to examining the pattern more closely than he had yet had a chance of doing. He was puzzled to think why it should have struck Miss Denton so forcibly. It seemed to him not specially remarkable or pretty. No doubt it was suitable enough for a curtain pattern. It ran in vertical bands, and there was some indication that these were intended to converge at the top. She was right, too, in thinking that these main bands resembled rippling, almost curling, tresses of hair. Well, the main thing was to find out by means of trade directories, or otherwise, what firm would undertake the reproduction of an old pattern of this kind. Not to delay the reader over this portion of the story, a list of likely names was made out, and Mr. Denton fixed a day for calling on them, or some of them, with his sample. The first 2 visits which he paid were unsuccessful, but there is luck in odd numbers. The firm in Bermondsey, which was third on his list, was accustomed to handling this line. The evidence they were able to produce justified their being entrusted with the job. Our Mr. Cattell took a fervent personal interest in it. "It's trending, isn't it, sir?" he said. "To picture the quantity of really lovely medieval stuff of this kind that lays well nigh unnoticed in many of our residential country houses. Much of it in peril, I take it, of being cast aside as so much rubbish. What is it Shakespeare says? Unconsidered trifles." "Ah, I often say he, as a word for us all, sir. I say Shakespeare, but I'm well aware all don't hold with me there. I had something of an upset the other day when a gentleman came in. A titled man, too, he was, and I think he told me he'd wrote on the topic. And I happened to cite out something about Hercules and the painted cloth. Dear me, you never see such a pother. But as to this, what you've kindly confided to us, it's a piece of work we shall take a real enthusiasm in achieving it out to the very best of our ability. What man has done, as I was observing only a few weeks back to another esteemed client, man can do, and in 3 to 4 weeks' time, all being well, we shall hope to lay before you evidence to that effect, sir. Take the address, Mr. Higgins, if you please." Such was the general drift of Mr. Cattell's observations on the occasion of his first interview with Mr. Denton. About a month later, being advised that some samples were ready for his inspection, Mr. Denton met him again, and had, it seems, reason to be satisfied with the faithfulness of the reproduction of the design. It had been finished off at the top in accordance with the indication I mentioned, so that the vertical bands joined. But something still needed to be done in the way of matching the color of the original. Mr. Cattell had suggestions of a technical kind to offer, with which I need not trouble you. He had also views as to the general desirability of the pattern which were vaguely adverse. "You say you don't wish this to be supplied excepting to personal friends equipped with an authorization from yourself, sir. It shall be done. I quite understand your wish to keep it exclusive. Lends a catch, does it not, to the suite. What's every man's, it's been said, is no man's." "Do you think it would be popular if it were generally obtainable?" asked Mr. Denton. "I hardly think it, sir," said Cattell, pensively clasping his beard. "I hardly think it. Not popular. It wasn't popular with the man that cut the block, was it, Mr. Higgins? Did he find it a difficult job? He'd no call to do so, sir. But the fact is that the artistic temperament, and our men are artists, sir, every man of them, true artists as much as many that the world styles by that term, it's apt to take some strange, hardly accountable likes or dislikes, and here was an example. The twice or thrice that I went to inspect his progress, language I could understand, for that's habitual to him, but real distaste for what I should call a dainty enough thing I did not, nor am I now able to fathom. It seemed, said Mr. Cattell, looking narrowly upon Mr. Denton, as if the man scented something almost heavil in the design. Indeed. Did he tell you so? I can't say I see anything sinister in it myself. Neither can I, sir. In fact, I said as much. Come, Gatwick, I said, what's to do here? What's the reason of your prejudice, for I can call it no more than that? But no explanation was forthcoming, and I was merely reduced, as I am now, to a shrug of the shoulders and a cui bono. However, here it is, and with that, the technical side of the question came to the front again. The matching of the colors for the background, the hem and the knots of ribbon was by far the longest part of the business, and necessitated many sendings to and fro of the original pattern and of new samples. During part of August and September, too, the Dentons were away from the manor, so that it was not until October was well in that a sufficient quantity of the stuff had been manufactured to furnish curtains for the 3 or 4 bedrooms which were to be fitted up with it. On the feast of Simon and Jude, the aunt and nephew returned from a short visit to find all completed, and their satisfaction at the general effect was great. The new curtains, in particular, agreed to admiration with their surroundings. When Mr. Denton was dressing for dinner and took stock of his room, in which there was a large amount of the chintz displayed, he congratulated himself over and over again on the luck which had first made him forget his aunt's commission and had then put into his hands this extremely effective means of remedying his mistake. The pattern was, as he said at dinner, so restful and yet so far from being dull, and Miss Denton, who by the way had none of the stuff in her own room, was much disposed to agree with him. At breakfast next morning he was induced to qualify his satisfaction to some extent, but very slightly. "There is one thing I rather regret," he said, "that we allowed them to join up the vertical bands of the pattern at the top. I think it would have been better to leave that alone." "Oh," said his aunt interrogatively. "Yes, as I was reading in bed last night they kept catching my eye rather. That is, I found myself looking across at them every now and then. There was an effect as if someone kept peeping out between the curtains in one place or another, where there was no edge, and I think that was due to the joining up of the bands at the top. The only other thing that troubled me was the wind. Why, I thought it was a perfectly still night. Perhaps it was only on my side of the house, but there was enough to sway my curtains and rustle them more than I wanted." That night, a bachelor friend of James Denton's came to stay, and was lodged in a room on the same floor as his host, but at the end of a long passage, halfway down which was a red baize door, put there to cut off the draught and intercept noise. The party of 3 had separated. Miss Denton a good first, the 2 men at about 11. James Denton, not yet inclined for bed, sat him down in an armchair and read for a time. Then he dozed, and then he woke, and bethought himself that his brown spaniel, which ordinarily slept in his room, had not come upstairs with him. Then he thought he was mistaken, for happening to move his hand which hung down over the arm of the chair within a few inches of the floor, he felt on the back of it just the slightest touch of a surface of hair, and stretching it out in that direction, he stroked and patted around it something. But the feel of it, and still more the fact that instead of a responsive movement, absolute stillness greeted his touch, made him look over the arm. What he had been touching rose to meet him. It was in the attitude of one that had crept along the floor on its belly, and it was, so far as could be collected, a human figure. But of the face which was now rising to within a few inches of his own no feature was discernible, only hair. Shapeless as it was, there was about it so horrible an air of menace that as he bounded from his chair and rushed from the room, he heard himself moaning with fear, and doubtless he did right to fly. As he dashed into the baize door that cut the passage in two, and forgetting that it opened towards him, beat against it with all the force in him, he felt a soft ineffectual tearing at his back which, all the same, seemed to be growing in power, as if the hand, or whatever worse than a hand was there, were becoming more material as the pursuer's rage was more concentrated. Then he remembered the trick of the door. He got it open, he shut it behind him. He gained his friend's room, and that is all we need know. It seems curious that, during all the time that had elapsed since the purchase of Pointer's diary, James Denton should not have sought an explanation of the presence of the pattern that had been pinned into it. Well, he had read the diary through without finding it mentioned, and had concluded that there was nothing to be said. But on leaving Rendcombe Manor, he did not know whether for good, as he naturally insisted upon doing on the day after experiencing the horror I have tried to put into words, he took the diary with him, and at his seaside lodgings he examined more narrowly the portion whence the pattern had been taken. What he remembered having suspected about it turned out to be correct. 2 or 3 leaves were pasted together, but written upon, as was patent when they were held up to the light. They yielded easily to steaming, for the paste had lost much of its strength, and they contained something relevant to the pattern. The entry was made in 1707. Old Mr. Casbury of Accrington told me this day much of young Sir Everard Charlett, whom he remembered commoner of University College, and thought was of the same family as Dr. Arthur Charlett, now Master of Ye Cole. This Charlett was a personable young gent, but a loose atheistical companion, and a great lifter, as they then called the hard drinkers, and for what I know do so now. He was noted, and subject to several censures at different times for his extravagancies, and if the full history of his debaucheries had been known, no doubt would have been expelled ye Cole. Supposing that no interest had been employed on his behalf, of which Mr. Casbury had some suspicion. He was a very beautiful person, and constantly wore his own hair, which was very abundant, from which, and his loose way of living, the cant name for him was Absalom. And he was accustomed to say that indeed he believed he had shortened old David's days, meaning his father, Sir Job Charlett, an old worthy cavalier. Note that Mr. Casbury said that he remembers not the year of Sir Everard Charlett's death, but it was 1692 or 3. He died suddenly in October. Several lines describing his unpleasant habits and reputed delinquencies are omitted. Having seen him in such topping spirits the night before, Mr. Casbury was amazed when he learned the death. He was found in the town ditch, the hair, as was said, plucked clean off his head. Most bells in Oxford rung out for him, being a nobleman, and he was buried next night in St. Peter's in the East. But 2 years after, being to be moved to his country estate by his successor, it was said the coffin, breaking by mischance, proved quite full of hair. Which sounds fabulous, but yet I believe precedents are upon record, as in Dr. Plott's History of Staffordshire. His chambers being afterwards stripped, Mr. Casbury came by part of the hangings of it, which 'twas said this Charlett had designed expressly for a memorial of his hair, giving the fellow that drew it a lock to work by. And the piece which I have fastened in here was parcel of the same, which Mr. Casbury gave to me. He said he believed there was a subtlety in the drawing, but had never discovered it himself, nor much like to pore upon it. The money spent upon the curtains might as well have been thrown into the fire as they were. Mr. Cattell's comment upon what he heard of the story took the form of a quotation from Shakespeare. You may guess it without difficulty. It began with the words, "There are more things." Chapter 3. An episode of cathedral history. There was once a learned gentleman who was deputed to examine and report upon the archives of the Cathedral of Southminster. The examination of these records demanded a very considerable expenditure of time, hence it became advisable for him to engage lodgings in the city. For though the cathedral body were profuse in their offers of hospitality, Mr. Lake felt that he would prefer to be master of his day. This was recognized as reasonable. The Dean eventually wrote advising Mr. Lake, if he were not already suited, to communicate with Mr. Warby, the principal verger, who occupied a house convenient to the church and was prepared to take in a quiet lodger for 3 or 4 weeks. Such an arrangement was precisely what Mr. Lake desired. Terms were easily agreed upon, and early in December, like another Mr. Datchery, as he remarked to himself, the investigator found himself in the occupation of a very comfortable room in an ancient and cathedraly house. One so familiar with the customs of cathedral churches, and treated with such obvious consideration by the dean and chapter of this cathedral in particular, could not fail to command the respect of the head verger. Mr. Warby even acquiesced in certain modifications of statements he had been accustomed to offer for years to parties of visitors. Mr. Lake, on his part, found the verger a very cheery companion, and took advantage of any occasion that presented itself for enjoying his conversation when the day's work was over. One evening about 9 o'clock, Mr. Warby knocked at his lodger's door. "I've occasion," he said, "to go across to the cathedral, Mr. Lake, and I think I made you a promise when I did so next. I would give you the opportunity to see what it looks like at night time. It is quite fine and dry outside if you care to come." "To be sure I will, very much obliged to you, Mr. Warby, for thinking of it, but let me get my coat." "Here it is, sir, and I've another lantern here that you'll find advisable for the steps, as there's no moon. Anyone might think we were Jasper and Durdles over again, mightn't they? Said Lake as they crossed the close, for he had ascertained that the verger had read Edwin Drood. Well, so they might, said Mr. Warby with a short laugh, though I don't know whether we ought to take it as a compliment. Odd ways, I often think, they had at that cathedral. Don't it seem so to you, sir? Full choral matins at 7 o'clock in the morning all the year round. Wouldn't suit our boys' voices nowadays, and I think there's one or two of the men would be applying for a rise if the chapter was to bring it in, particularly the altos. They were now at the southwest door. As Mr. Warby was unlocking it, Lake said, "Did you ever find anybody locked in here by accident?" "Twice I did. One was a drunk sailor. However he got in, I don't know. I suppose he went to sleep in the service, but by the time I got to him, he was praying fit to bring the roof in. Law, what a noise that man did make. Said it was the first time he'd been inside a church for 10 years, and blessed if ever he'd try it again. The other was an old sheep. Them boys it was, up to their games. That was the last time they tried it on, though. There, sir, now you see what we look like. Our late Dean used now and again to bring parties in, but he preferred a moonlight night, and there was a piece of verse he'd quote to 'em, relating to a Scotch cathedral. I understand, but I don't know. I almost think the effect's better when it's all dark-like. Seems to add to the size and height. Now, if you won't mind stopping somewhere in the nave while I go up into the choir where my business lays, you'll see what I mean." Accordingly, Lake waited, leaning against a pillar, and watched the light wavering along the length of the church and up the steps into the choir until it was intercepted by some screen or other furniture, which only allowed the reflection to be seen on the piers and roof. Not many minutes had passed before Warby reappeared at the door of the choir, and by waving his lantern signalled to Lake to rejoin him. "I suppose it is Warby, and not a substitute," thought Lake to himself as he walked up the nave. There was, in fact, nothing untoward. Warby showed him the papers which he had come to fetch out of the dean's stall, and asked him what he thought of the spectacle. Lake agreed that it was well worth seeing. "I suppose," he said, as they walked towards the altar steps together, "that you're too much used to going about here at night to feel nervous, but you must get a start every now and then, don't you? When a book falls down or a door swings to." "No, Mr. Lake, I can't say I think much about noises, not nowadays. I'm much more afraid of finding an escape of gas or a burst in the stovepipes than anything else. Still, there have been times, years ago. Did you notice that plain altar tomb there? 15th century, we say it is. I don't know if you agree to that. Well, if you didn't look at it, just come back and give it a glance, if you'd be so good. It was on the north side of the choir, and rather awkwardly placed, only about 3 feet from the enclosing stone screen. Quite plain, as the verger had said, but for some ordinary stone panelling. A metal cross of some size on the northern side that next to the screen was the solitary feature of any interest. Lake agreed that it was not earlier than the Perpendicular period, but, he said, unless it's the tomb of some remarkable person, you'll forgive me for saying that I don't think it's particularly noteworthy. Well, I can't say as it is the tomb of anybody noted in history, said Warby, who had a dry smile on his face, for we don't own any record whatsoever of who it was put up to. For all that, if you've half an hour to spare, sir, when we get back to the house, Mr. Lake, I could tell you a tale about that tomb. I won't begin on it now. It strikes cold here, and we don't want to be dawdling about all night. Of course I should like to hear it immensely. Very well, sir, you shall. Now, if I might put a question to you, he went on, as they passed down the choir aisle, in our little local guide, and not only there, but in the little book on our cathedral in the series, you'll find it stated that this portion of the building was erected previous to the 12th century. Now, of course, I should be glad enough to take that view, but mind the step, sir, but I put it to you, does the lay of the stone err in this portion of the wall, which he tapped with his key, does it to your eye carry the flavour of what you might call Saxon masonry? No, I thought not. No more it does to me. Now, if you'll believe me, I've said as much to those men. One's the librarian of our free library here, and the other came down from London on purpose, 50 times if I have once. But I might just as well have talked to that bit of stonework. But there it is. I suppose everyone's got their opinions. The discussion of this peculiar trait of human nature occupied Mr. Warby almost up to the moment when he and Lake re-entered the former's house. The condition of the fire in Lake's sitting room led to a suggestion from Mr. Warby that they should finish the evening in his own parlour. We find them accordingly settled there some short time afterwards. Mr. Warby made his story a long one, and I will not undertake to tell it wholly in his own words or in his own order. Lake committed the substance of it to paper immediately after hearing it, together with some few passages of the narrative which had fixed themselves verbatim in his mind. I shall probably find it expedient to condense Lake's record to some extent. Mr. Warby was born, it appeared, about the year 1828. His father before him had been connected with the cathedral, and likewise his grandfather. One or both had been choristers, and in later life both had done work as mason and carpenter respectively about the fabric. Warby himself, though possessed, as he frankly acknowledged, of an indifferent voice, had been drafted into the choir at about 10 years of age. It was in 1840 that the wave of the Gothic revival smote the Cathedral of Southminster. "There was a lot of lovely stuff went then, sir," said Warby with a sigh. "My father couldn't hardly believe it when he got his orders to clear out the choir. There was a new dean just come in, Dean Burscough it was, and my father had been prenticed to a good firm of joiners in the city, and knew what good work was when he saw it. Cruel it was, he used to say, all that beautiful wainscot oak, as good as the day it was put up, and garlands like of foliage and fruit, and lovely old gilding work on the coats of arms and the organ pipes. All went to the timber yard, every bit except some little pieces worked up in the Lady Chapel, and ere in this overmantel. Well, I may be mistook, but I say our choir never looked as well since. Still there was a lot found out about the history of the church, and no doubt but what it did stand in need of repair. There was very few winters past but what we'd lose a pinnacle." Mr. Lake expressed his concurrence with Warby's views of restoration, but owns to a fear about this point, lest the story proper should never be reached. Possibly this was perceptible in his manner. Warby hastened to reassure him, "Not but what I could carry on about that topic for hours at a time, and do when I see my opportunity. But Dean Burscough, he was very set on the Gothic period, and nothing would serve him but everything must be made agreeable to that. And one morning after service he appointed for my father to meet him in the choir, and he came back after he'd taken off his robes in the vestry, and he'd got a roll of paper with him, and the verger that was then brought in a table, and they begun spreading it out on the table with prayer books to keep it down, and my father helped 'em. And he saw it was a picture of the inside of a choir in a cathedral, and the dean, he was a quick-spoken gentleman, he says, 'Well, Warby, what do you think of that?' 'Why,' says my father, 'I don't think I have the pleasure of knowing that view.' 'Would that be Hereford Cathedral, Mr. Dean?' 'No, Warby,' says the dean, 'that's Southminster Cathedral, as we hope to see it before many years.' 'Indeed, sir,' says my father. And that was all he did say, leastways to the dean. But he used to tell me he felt really faint in himself when he looked round our choir as I can remember it, all comfortable and furnished-like, and then see this nasty little dry picture, as he called it, drawn out by some London architect. Well, there I am again, but you'll see what I mean if you look at this old view." Warby reached down a framed print from the wall. Well, the long and the short of it was that the dean he handed over to my father a copy of an order of the chapter that he was to clear out every bit of the choir, make a clean sweep, ready for the new work that was being designed up in town, and he was to put it in hand as soon as ever he could get the breakers together. Now then, sir, if you look at that view, you'll see where the pulpit used to stand. That's what I want you to notice, if you please." It was indeed easily seen, an unusually large structure of timber with a domed sounding board, standing at the east end of the stalls on the north side of the choir, facing the bishop's throne. Warby proceeded to explain that during the alterations, services were held in the nave, the members of the choir being thereby disappointed of an anticipated holiday, and the organist in particular, incurring the suspicion of having willfully damaged the mechanism of the temporary organ that was hired at considerable expense.